Welcome, everybody, to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. It is great to be with you again on Millennials Are Killing Capitalism live, I should say. It's great to see so many of you. It's afternoon here, but good morning to all of you where it is morning where you are. And yeah, I'm excited about today. I should say a couple things up front. I think this is, well, I know for sure this is going to be at least a two-part discussion, and hopefully it'll be kind of an ongoing thing. I would like that. I think the next one, Alex can correct me if I'm wrong on this, is going to be next Thursday, and David Chavez is going to join us for that too. But we'll put out the official, information on that, you know, within the next few days. But we're going to be talking a little bit about a figure, Lucio Cabanas. Again, Alex can correct me on that. That is important in the book Specters of Revolution, and also I guess this year marks the 50th anniversary of their assassination. So maybe Alex could say a few words about that too, in our discussion today, just to kind of get folks familiar with that topic before we get into it next week. Alexander Aviña is a historian and professor and the son of undocumented migrants from Michoacán, Mexico, whose sacrifices and love made these educational achievements possible. He is currently an associate professor of history in the School of Philosophical and Religious Studies at Arizona State University. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the various areas that Alex is interested in. He researches and covers a lot of different topics. Folks probably familiar with him from his work with The East is a Podcast. Shout out to Sina Rahmani, as always, as well as with podcasts like Guerrilla History and Revolutionary Left Radio. So anyways, it's exciting to have him back on. And today we're going to kind of talk a little bit about the border politics around the border right now. We'll talk about, international things that are going on, anti-imperialist discussion. And I'm sure we'll touch on topics related to the genocide in Palestine and so on. But yeah, so anyways, before I say any more, let me welcome Alex to the show. It's good to be with you.
What's up, Jay? Thanks for having me back.
It's been too long, and I'm glad to have you back. It's good to be in conversation with you again. So, like, one of the things that just prompted this discussion for me was just one. I always see you as somebody on Twitter who's like responding to kind of all of the different, takes you see from politicians around the politics of the border, I guess you could say, for lack of a better term, or also the politics of immigration and migration, of course. And I don't know how generalizable what I've been witnessing in the Pennsylvania region that we exchanged some tweets the other day about, like, some of the ads that we have from our senator. I don't want to claim him, but the senator that is responsible for my region, who's Bob Casey, who is a Democrat, is definitely super, like, he is, I'm one of those people who get pissed off and I'll email things to my representatives, and he always writes back the most absurd things, like whether it's about me writing something about Cuba and lifting the blockade, or writing something about Gaza and the genocide. He always comes up with these very, like, fascistic kind of talking points and very, imperialist kind of point of view. So it's not somebody I've ever been like, oh, this guy has good politics. But in this particular campaign, he's running against a kind of Trump right-wing, CEO of a former, like, former CEO of a hedge fund or whatever. And, like, on one hand, he's like branding this person as a communist, saying that he in his role of this hedge fund, he helped build up the Chinese military to be able to attack the United States. But more to the point of what I wanted to talk to you about is like there's these really wild border ads in Pennsylvania. And I don't know if anybody knows this, but Pennsylvania does not actually border Mexico or, it's not that close. Obviously there is a significant immigrant population, in the cities, but it comes from like all over the world. And anyway, it's just an interesting thing to see. It's not something I'm so used to seeing this early before a campaign and this far out. And yeah, I mean, his ads in particular, I probably could show them, but I don't really want to. But like, they basically, uh, he's using these tropes of fentanyl, coming in through the border and wanting to have talk, promoting the fact that he has voted for the quote unquote toughest border policies in US history and stuff like this. And it's just very interesting. It's not that I think that Democrats are you more what I'm used to. Like I was thinking about this too in terms of like there was there's been anti Kamala ads that are starting to come out, right? Kamala Harris. And they're all about the fact that she's like pro open borders is what they say, which of course we'll get into that too.
I wish. I wish. Yeah.
But like there's this idea of because if you go back to the 2020 campaign in the primary debates, there were actually these discussions around like, would you know, do you prosecute undocumented folks, right? Do you deport them? Are they able to access your Medicare for all pie in the sky fantasy, which doesn't actually exist and never will?
Yeah.
Um, and so it was an interesting time in that sense, in that you saw Democratic presidential candidates actually trying to walk a line that was more towards, I would say, at least accommodating a lot of left wing thinking around the border left of the Democrats, and more popular policies around like Medicare for all and thinking about sort of inclusion in these ways. And
Yeah.
now we're 4 years out, and it's similar, like, also in some respects to, like, the the change that we've seen with defund the police, where, like, at a certain point, there had to be some discussion about police reform and, like, accountability, and then it shifted here in Pennsylvania of just, like, every candidate was trying harder than everybody else to say how pro-police they were. So it's, like, a similar kind of thing where now I feel like all the candidates, regardless of what party affiliation they have, are talking about how strong they would be on the border, how many border patrol that they would assign, et cetera. And so I just interested, I don't know if you're seeing that shift where you are. I know you're in Arizona, which probably always has crazy, politics around this. Um, but I wanted to bring you on to talk about like, is there something new you think that's animating this alignment, or like where do you see this stuff coming from?
Yeah. I don't necessarily see it as something new. I perhaps like the really limited range of possibilities when it comes to dealing with migration on the border coming from the Democrats. Perhaps that's something relatively new. Um, uh, I, you know, I think we're witnessing, I don't know, I don't want to say culmination, but we're witnessing part of a intensification of a process that really takes off with Ronald Reagan in the 80s. And this involves both the militarization of the US Mexico border and the criminalization of undocumented migrants and refugees. Um, it's we now know, historians have shown that the Reagan administration used refugee status or asylum status as a geopolitical tool to choose, which asylum seekers to favor based on geopolitical goals, right? So favoring Cuban refugees who were coming in the 1980s and after, even though many of them suffered horrific detention and really were part of the rise of private for-profit prisons system in the United States in the 80s. Cuban refugees and asylum seekers were housed in a lot of these incipient penal institutions. So since at least, I think the Carter administration, we start to see a push toward this, but it's really in the 1980s for a variety of reasons where we see again the large scale criminalization of undocumented migrants and refugees on the one hand, and then creating the U.S.-Mexico border into this highly militarized zone, often using leftover materiel and weaponry and technology that failed the United States in Vietnam. I mean, if you look through newspaper accounts from the 80s, journalists will make that connection very clear. They'll talk about how sniper scopes, weapons, fence material that the U.S. used in Vietnam, they just brought back. Sensor technology they just brought back and applied it at the U.S.-Mexico border. And the premise that fueled both of these processes is that is the premise of border security. The idea that the U.S. is somehow unsafe because its southern flank, its Maginot Line, which is another metaphor that gets thrown around so much, beginning in the 50s and 60s, really, that this country needs to militarize its southern border. It needs to build walls. It needs to increase its technological surveillance capacities and to prevent people from coming into the United States. And this, again, really ramps up under Reagan. He connects it to the war on drugs. And that's when you start to see this convergence that we see in Bob Casey's ad. We see this convergence, it's a convergence, but also it's a purposeful muddling of categories all into one figure, which is like the dangerous criminal alien who's also smuggling fentanyl into the country. So you create it's a political, useful figure to justify across both parties increasingly punitive, murderous, and I would even say genocidal policies at the U.S.-Mexico border. Even though we know, like there's so many brilliant people that for so many years have dedicated so much of their scholarly lives to debunk all these myths and lies that we hear about migrants on the border, right? With the old one being migrants come into the United States and they steal jobs. No, they don't. They actually create more jobs. Migrants come in here and take advantage of our lucrative, extensive, generous social welfare state. No, they don't. People like my parents paid billions of dollars in taxes into the system that they'll never be able to get back because when they did so, they had undocumented status. The latest one, right? Since fentanyl began as a public emergency in 2016, 2017, as Americans started to switch from other opioids to this increasingly powerful one, is that undocumented migrants are, and even refugees, which is also a muddling of categories, are the ones responsible for flooding the streets with fentanyl, which we know people have shown over and over again that something like in the high 80s to the mid 90% of people who are caught bringing fentanyl into the U.S. are U.S. citizens, and many of whom are like economically downward. Some of them are, addicted to the drug themselves and are trying to make ends meet, right? So all these lies and all these myths you really see manifested in that horrific ad that you sent me from Bob Casey. And what you see is, again, there's a bipartisan agreement on the premise of border security and that we need border security. And the only difference for me is that the policies more or less have been the same since the 1980s, 1990s. I mean, if go and look up Bill Clinton's speech from 95 or 96 when he's talking about undocumented migrants and new laws that criminalize migrants that he helped put into law. He's indistinguishable from a Republican today. And this is when I watched that Bob Casey ad, it's the same thing. Really, there's no difference in what Trumpers have been saying. What happens is that the Democrats share into this premise, and that then allows the Republicans to get even more radical. Right. So at the RNC, right, that one night where all these Republican delegates were holding up the mass deportation now signs, right, like the little Nazi rally. That's horrific. Right. But they're enabled to do that because the Democrats since the 80s have shifted so far to the right when it comes to the border issue and when it comes to the migration issue. And again, it's that premise of border security. It's that premise that these people materialize out of nowhere at the U.S.-Mexico border. Like that's where the problem starts. Not with U.S. foreign policy, not with U.S. imperial policy in Latin America and the Caribbean, not with U.S. Neoliberal economic policies that they pushed onto the region since the 1980s to today. They take this position where these people suddenly materialize at the U.S.-Mexico border, and that's where we have to confront the issue. And the way we confront the issue is more border wall, more border police, and the increasing weaponization of natural landscapes like the Sonoran Desert, where I'm, currently about 3 hours. Well, I'm in the Sonoran Desert, but the part that the U.S. and Mexico share, right? That since the mid 90s, we've seen the U.S. government weaponize that landscape through their prevention through deterrence program, where they essentially don't build walls there because they think, no, there's no one crazy enough to attempt that cross. And what has happened since the mid 90s, a conservative estimate has been that something like 10,000 people have died trying to make that cross. That's a low estimate, right? I've seen estimates as high as 50, 60, 70,000 people. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of lives that have been rendered disposable by both political parties. So they can make a political calculus that being quote unquote tough on the border and tough on quote unquote criminal aliens will somehow help them in political elections. And again, for me, the only difference I really see in the last two and a half decades is rhetoric style, because in policy they're sharing the same things. The Democrats will say, we don't want walls, but we want smart walls. We don't want, we want smarter police. We want smarter surveillance. We want smarter punitive policies. But again, they're still sharing the same fundamental premise with the Republicans, which is quote unquote border security. And as long as we have that in place politically, then more people are going to die at the U.S.-Mexico border trying to make this incredibly dangerous cross.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and show folks that ad just so people have the context too of like what we're talking about. YouTube is lucky they're getting a free political ad out of me.
Fentanyl and crime, they're coming from our southern border, and Bob Casey is working to stop it. He voted for the toughest border bill in history, backed by Border Patrol agents. 1,500 new border agents, a fast track to deport those charged with violent crimes. And Casey passed a new law to crack down on the cartels.
Senator Bob Casey is pushing a new bill that would crack down on the supply chain for fentanyl.
Tell Bob Casey, keep fighting to defend our border.
I mean, it's insane. It's insane in the sense that, like, again, that muddling of categories for political utility. Also, the difference between an undocumented migrant versus someone who is trying to claim asylum status in the U.S. So when they actually make it to the U.S.-Mexico border, they're not trying to cross. They're not trying to evade the Border Patrol. They're actually searching out the Border Patrol so they can turn themselves over to them and so they can claim asylum status and then go through that legal process, which, thanks to Biden and thanks to the Democrats, has been rendered practically impossible at this point. That toughest border bill in history that the Democrats tried to pass and they were unable to because of Republican intransigence, that bill would have made asylum in the United States practically impossible. So when it failed in Congress, I think that's when it resulted in some sort of executive directive from the Biden administration. And again, instead of thinking about why people are fleeing their homes, why are people engaging in incredibly dangerous journeys from Venezuela, from Cuba, from other parts of South America, from Central America, just risking unimaginable things to get to the U.S. and then turn themselves over to a United States agent to claim asylum. Instead of thinking about that, no, we're just going to treat them the moment they appear on U.S. territory, and then we're going to take a carceral approach. And that's, like, to me, it's like the most gringo reaction ever, right? But that's increasingly what we've seen in the last 3 decades. And it's by no surprise, right? It's no surprise that, like, in the last 5 to 8 years, the largest number of folks coming to the United States to claim asylum status have been from Venezuela, have been from Cuba, right? Why? Because the U.S. has been waging, in the Cuban case, they've been waging economic war for decades now, right? In the Venezuelan case, I think it was Obama who first designated them a national security threat to the United States, which is insane, right? But then under the Trump administration, he's the one who really intensified the sanctions and the economic warfare against Venezuela, which there's been this really interesting series that has been coming out in the Washington Post by journalist Jeff Stein, I think is the lead, where they've been examining, like, the impact of the U.S. economic war that they've been waging against, like, something like 60% of the countries on earth. And when the article that they write where they focus on Venezuela, they talk about how the sanctions that Trump implemented and intensified during his administration created something like the equivalent of 3 US Great Depressions in Venezuela. Of course, people are going to leave. And the Americans were told, look, you do this. You had Mexican officials telling the Americans, if you guys do these sanctions, Venezuelans are going to leave, and guess where they're going to go? And that's what we've seen, right? So, and this is part of a longer historical pattern, right? The great Puerto Rican journalist Juan Gonzalez has a book called Harvest of Empire, where he says, look, Latino presence in the US is the result of US empire in Latin America and the Caribbean, hence the title, right? Harvest of Empire. So this is not a new phenomenon, but we just see the processes that fuel that migration and that movement and that displacement are a little different. The countries of origin are a little different. But in essence, it's still a consequence of US empire in Latin America and the Caribbean, forcing people to leave their beloved homelands. Like, honestly, like one thing I wish I could make Americans understand, like people watching Bob Casey's, commercial and being like, oh yeah, he's doing great things. Your folks don't want to leave their homes. And I know this from personal experience, right? Because my parents were forced to leave. People don't want to leave their homes, their communities, the places that they know, that they feel comfortable with, that they give them meaning in life and identification, right? They do this out of as a consequence of really dramatic actions and processes, not because they're here to steal jobs or to, again, take advantage of our, extremely generous, welfare state. And I think, we saw that at the beginning of the Biden administration. We saw that Kamala Harris, who's now been designated the open border czar by the Republicans, she did a tour, right? She was designated with examining the root causes of Central American migration to the U.S. And what did she do? She went to Guatemala and told people, do not come. So you cannot tell people, do not come on the one hand, when on the other hand, you're fueling the political and socioeconomic destabilization that's forcing people to flee. But honestly, that's all we've seen. I mean, I think that's all in my lifetime. I think the one politician that has offered a different vision of migration and the border away from that border security framing was like when Bernie Sanders ran in the primary in 2016. Like, if you look up his plan, like, it's actually not bad relative to what we've been, bombarded by for the last 3 decades. So we're at a point now where there's very little difference in policy and even style, right? If you watch, looking at that Casey campaign, between both political parties. And I think this is part of a broader issue now, especially since, and this kind of, to me, in my mind, brings into issue Gaza and climate change. We've seen massive displacement of human beings around the world in the last 15, 20 years, right? So it's also no accident that this border security paradigm has become much more punitive and much more lethal in the United States. But it's a response to people moving. And one of the big drivers has been climate change. And this is something we've seen around the world. The Mediterranean Sea has been weaponized by quote unquote Fortress Europe for at least 20 years now, right? They have their own murderous border police called Frontex. They use Israeli drones to patrol the Mediterranean Sea. They work with Libyan militias and a Libyan carceral network to detain African migrants who are trying to make it into Europe. We've seen massacres of African immigrants who are trying to gain access into Spanish enclaves in Northern Africa. So we've seen thousands and thousands of people who have drowned in the Mediterranean. We have extensive evidence that Frontex or Greek Coast Guard, they'll watch people drown. They'll watch ships capsize, thousands and thousands of people. So again, it's a lethal disposability of human populations that have been rendered acceptable by the global North. And again, I mean, to my mind, this is genocide, by another name. We don't use the word genocide when we talk about the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of migrants that have died globally trying to find a better life in the last 10, 15 20 years. But it feels like it. It's you see how we could categorize this immense amount of death as such. The excuse is, and this is something that the U.S. has done at the U.S.-Mexico border, and this is something that the Europeans have done in the Mediterranean Sea, because they weaponize land and seascapes. They displace responsibility when they damn well know what they're doing, right? If you look at their internal documents, they know what they're doing, but it gives them almost like a plausible deniability that they're somehow responsible directly for the deaths of tens of thousands of people who are trying to escape horrific situations in their home countries caused by global North economic and imperial policies, only to meet their demise, their death in the Mediterranean Sea, in a Libyan prison, or at the Sonoran Desert that separates the U.S. and Mexico.
Appreciate all that. It's a great breakdown of it all. The only thing that I would add is that, like, as you talked about this creation of, I don't remember the term you used, but just talking about uh, the migrant and how it comes to embody all of these different things, how all these things kind of collapse into one of, the criminal, the gang member, the cartel member, the drug dealer, and the job stealer, right? And all
Yeah.
of these things. Yeah, I mean, that there's a term called folk devil that I think Stanley Cohen came up with the concept of it in a book called Folk Devils and Moral Panics. But Cedric Robinson also talked about this in his work around racial regimes, and I think, like, that's a really interesting, concept to think about. It's like, just a basic Wikipedia definition is a person or a group of people who are portrayed in folklore or the media as outsiders and deviant, and who are blamed for crimes and other sorts of social problems, right? And so, like, we can see
totally.
how it's like encapsulates this again, like it is a racial regime, right? Like, it's like, you know, we're talking about, as you say, these very clear, significant, large scale historical projects. When we think about imperialism, we think about all the sanctions that the United States conducts, in Venezuela. Obviously, we're seeing right now, we just had the elections in Venezuela, and the 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 Western media, State Department, etc., kind of stepping out to proclaim that Maduro didn't win before the results are even tabulated and so on, right? And it's you see how much they and I mean, that's just like the election, but obviously the bigger story is that the sanctions that have been going on for a long time now, which have continuously increased, and Trump obviously took them to another level, but Obama, started them out. And yeah, and well, Bush might have had some too, but Obama had more as well. And so anyways, it's a prospect of, like, just trying to develop this sovereign project that's outside of what outside of just saying, hey, like, all our resources, you can just come and have them and do what we want, and we'll just be a very pro-capitalist, happy partner of the United States. Any country that goes against that obviously is attacked economically, and when it becomes unlivable for people, then some of the people have to, they leave, and like you said, nobody wants to do that. Nobody and I think that's one of the great myths that, especially the right seizes on, but we see it in that Bob Casey ad too, is this idea that, like, yeah, I mean, I don't know, it's amazing that they can take the whole range of humanity and human emotions that would come through a process of migrating or seeking asylum, and try to conflate that with just sort of mass criminality and this, as we said, we talked about this a little bit before the show, is like, maybe a generous read of the Democratic Party is that they're focused on the white working class as the sort of historical subject, and they want to play to the anxieties of that group, right? And so yeah, I don't know if you have any more you say.
I mean, that's
a rant there.
No, that's an old tactic, right? So, one of the folks working in a Biden administration and now has switched over to Kamala Harris's campaign is a granddaughter of Cesar Chavez. Julie, I think her name is Julie Hernandez Chavez or something like that, and master's in Latin American studies from Berkeley, right? So she has read and engaged literature and professors who would offer an alternative reading of the border and migration akin to what we've discussed, right? But she's been working with the Democrats way back. I think she worked for Obama. The reason why I bring her up is because, her grandfather, Cesar Chavez, is lauded now as, this civil rights leader, right? The founder of the United Farm Workers, very important in unionizing field workers, 60s and 70s. But that contradiction in terms of who gets to be part of the working class and therefore part of a union, who doesn't, is manifested by the history of the United Farm Workers. Cesar Chavez's approach to undocumented migrants in the 60s and 70s was to treat them as scabs. And therefore, for a while, United Farm Workers had their own border police. They were helping the Border Patrol detain people that looked just like them. In many cases, came from the same areas, came for the same reasons. And it really took more radical Chicano movements in the early to mid 70s to push the United Farm Workers to be like, look, the problem is not the migrant, the problem is the boss. So you got to actually, reach out and organize the migrants. You got to hit up, not horizontally or down, until they finally, it got rid of that horrific tactic and approach toward undocumented migration, which in terms of Mexican undocumented migration really takes off after the mid 60s, especially in the 1970s, because, one of the lesser discussed civil rights bills of the mid 60s is the one that finally got rid of racial quotas when it came to migrants, legal migrants coming into the United States. And the number that they allotted for Mexican migrants was ridiculously low relative to their economic importance, particularly in Southwest agricultural businesses. So this law, which was good, it got rid of white supremacist migration law that had been put into place in the early 1920s with the National Origins Act, then set up the emergence of the quote unquote undocumented migrant, or as how they would come to be known in the 70s, the illegal alien, because you still had bosses in the U.S. that needed labor. And that the quota allotted to Mexican migrants, which was so low, was going to be quickly filled. And people were still going to come, right? There was employment, there was recruitment of Mexican workers still going on. So yeah, I think that example of what the United Farm Workers' initial approach to undocumented migration, I think illustrates a broader problem with what the Democrats are trying to do now, and especially Democrats like Bob Casey. But I think this is across the party now. Like I don't, with very few exceptions. I mean, there was a number of Democrats in the House, especially, that were really against that so-called toughest border bill ever designed, and against Biden's executive decree that essentially rendered practically impossible asylum. Folks like Raul Grijalva here in Southern Arizona. But I think Casey's position is becoming the norm. Trying to use the figure of the migrant to mobilize politically people who they think, might be susceptible to that message, whether they're white working class or not. And again, it's just part of it is inducing that fear, right? How do you displace, or how do you resolve internal contradictions? How do you fix internal political and socioeconomic contradictions within the U.S.? Well, one, it was historically to keep expanding the frontier, right? First, it was west by exterminating and colonizing native peoples. Then they went south to Mexico, Caribbean, Latin America. Then they went across the Pacific into East Asia. And now we're a global empire with 800 plus military bases around the world. And our dollar is the dominant currency in the world. That's one way. But I think another way that we see in these political ads to resolve the contradiction, you look at that outside threat in the figure of the migrant, the scary migrant, who not only are they quote unquote sneaking into the country and breaking the law, which, to be honest, if it's your first time crossing the border into the United States unauthorized, that's not even a criminal law. That's not even a criminal offense. That's like a civil misdemeanor. But that tends to get left out of these discussions as well. So you use this threat, you use this figure to kind of try to resolve some of these internal contradictions. And since the 80s, I mean, and the 80s is really interesting under the Reagan administration, where you start to see, and it's actually a guy who taught Latin American history here at Arizona State University, where I am. I never coincided with him, thankfully. He was involved in Iran-Contra, a really shady guy. He's the one who coined the term narco-terrorist in 1984, 1985. and then that gets linked to migrants so like you get the narco terrorist, Kremlin linked, Sandinista linked, PLO linked, undocumented migrant, all coming into the US using drugs to destabilize the United States from within. And that's why we need more border wall, more surveillance, more border police. And we've seen those processes unabated since the 1980s. And you see this reflect, you mentioned in terms of culture, popular culture, you see this reflected in movies in the 90s. Like a lot of times the bad guys in these like I grew up watching these bad like action films because of my dad. And like the bad guys in the 90s, like Predator 2 or Escape from LA. It's like the villain in Escape from LA is a guy by the name of Cuervo Jones, who's a shining path figure, right? Who's trying to bring down the United States, which is Shining Path being a Maoist Peruvian insurgent group. So all these figures, like all this gets wrapped up into the idea of the undocumented migrant, the quote unquote illegal alien that must be stopped at the border. It must be detained. And again, we've seen the political utility of this figure since then. And that's what I see in that Bob Casey ad. I mean, the one time we had a little bit of a reform under Obama, who rightfully so is remembered as a deporter in chief because he deported more people. I don't know if he still has that title. I don't know how Biden's doing, but Biden definitely has more deportations than Trump. So on the one hand, Obama was like, I'm going to show these Republicans that I'm serious about border security, right? So he deported more than 3 million people, supposedly all criminal and dangerous, but we know now that's bullshit. Those were the bad migrants. But with the good migrants, we're going to give them a pathway to citizenship. And this is like where the Dreamer program comes in. So you see, you're obviously interested in counterinsurgency, right? So this is this is an old counterinsurgent tactic that like militaries would apply against the good guerrillas versus the bad guerrillas. We can negotiate with the good guerrillas, help us get rid of the bad guerrilla force. I almost see something similar happening in the 2010s, right? And this is not, I'm not shitting on the Dreamers. I think that was an amazing movement that was pushed from below by a lot of brave and courageous students and young people. I'm talking about this more how like the U.S. government and particularly the Obama administration used it and viewed it. And the way they talked about it. And the way they talked about it was, these are the good migrants who came here through no fault of their own in undocumented fashion. Therefore, they shouldn't be punished. But their piece of shit parents who came, illegally, they're the bad ones. And that contradiction was never quite resolved by the Obama administration. But that's what the Dreamer program was meant to address. And then Trump comes in 2016 and we get something radically different, right? We get the cages, we get the family separation. We have the hundreds of kids who still have not been reunited with their parents. A practice that actually was initiated during the Obama administration, but becomes policy during the Trump administration, right? But we don't even see that now, right? Like I don't see anyone within the Democratic Party even attempting to be like the good migrant versus the bad migrant. Like all I see is do not come. All I see is making asylum practically impossible while still doing all the crazy shit abroad that generates the creation of refugees and asylum seekers to begin with. And this is why I call them, this is why whenever I see something online, I tweet at these people calling them children of men Democrats, like Alfonso Cuarón's brilliant movie. Like I think that's where we're headed, right? Like it's total punitive carceral approach to people who are trying to come to this country, whether as undocumented migrants or as refugees and asylum seekers. The response is going to be the same, and it's going to be one of carceral colonial style management that is only going to get more violent. It's not to like bum everyone out, but this is truly like the time of monsters when we look at migrants and migration movement, not just here too, like around the world.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I wanted to say quickly, because I didn't shout him out before, but Cesar Che Rodriguez is the scholar who introduced me to the folk devil concept through some of his discussion, actually, around the Oscar Grant moment conversation that we had with him, and talking about racial regimes and blues epistemology in the Bay Area leading up to that. And so shout out to Che. But one thing that I wanted to address that you kind of are talking about too is like these contradictions, right? And I think one of the things that I see that I've been a little bit leery of, right? Because there's certain people on the left who, and setting aside the fact that Biden is a genocidaire, which is like a huge thing to set aside for any reason, and I don't mean to do that, but just to talk about what certain people on the left find appealing in Biden, right? Is this his National Labor Review Board, his Federal Trade Commission, right? And so some of these things about appeals to worker rights within empire, seeming to be a little bit more of a regulator of, corporations, although that's just mostly window dressing, but it matters enough to the capitalists that some of them dislike those things.
Biden,
right? And
Biden, the Bonapartist. He's trying to be the
right.
Yeah.
But what I think is an important contradiction to think about amid that, right, is like what's going on right now within U.S. empire that suddenly there's an interest in worker rights or in the ability of people to unionize and to organize on their jobs, something that has been the Democratic Party has had no interest in supporting for the last 40 years, or so. And I think that it comes at a time when we see empire really, I believe, quite visibly starting to decline, right? Like you laid out the 800 military bases and all of the expansion that led to the rise of U.S. empire. But, we're seeing the U.S. struggle against, asymmetric resistance forces or against smaller militaries like Russia's, and not really, I know that these are proxy wars. I don't think the United States is that interested in fighting its own wars on any kind of large scale right now. But nonetheless, like it's not. I don't think that globally it is seen as dominant of a military force. And I think imperialism, to think with Samir Amin always does include the kind of two legs of the military and the economic element. And as the military is seen to be more vulnerable, then also you see, BRICS, or you see countries like China, Russia, Iran, you see Venezuela, Cuba. So you see countries starting to say, you know what, like we'll weather the sanctions. We're going to chart, our own trade agreements with people who don't want to be a part of this, this hegemonic orbit of the United States. And I think China in particular is a big, we see how, talk about folk devils, how like the government, how both parties treat China in all of their discussion of it as this like massive threat right now. So I think in that climate, like there has to also be a thinking about, well, our production, our manufacturing, etc., has happened overseas, like since what we call deindustrialization for, a lot of it has happened in China. And, so we may need to start to regrow our own manufacturing capability. You see Trump make appeals to this, even though it's like very half-assed all the time, but like the idea of redeveloping more domestic manufacturing capacity, in that you try to bring some more workers, quote unquote, like into the not quote unquote workers into the fold, right? But the white working class is what they're thinking about in terms of appeal to them. And so, yeah, I think that's another element of this too, is the like that there has been this effective campaign that has been run by the right for decades now around the idea that immigrant workers are stealing your jobs, right? And so like this these things kind of coincide in certain ways in terms of what could be a democratic or a left-leaning response where it's seemingly more pro-labor on certain issues than it has been in the past, but it's pro-labor and very kind of nativist, kind of I don't less inclusive.
It's chauvinist too.
Yeah, chauvinist. Yes. Yeah. So anyway.
Yeah. I think one part of this, I think, is U.S. liberalism, as it's linked to the Democratic Party, is in crisis, and it doesn't know how to resolve that that crisis internally. And this is where this is why their thing with Trump has been so effective for them politically, right? Because instead of stepping back and thinking about, why is essentially the failures of U.S. liberalism since quote unquote the end of history, in actually generating the type of economic and political well-being for the vast majority of U.S. citizens, right? They haven't accomplished that, right? So, and so there's an almost an existential crisis internal to U.S. liberalism, even though they won the Cold War, even though they defeated the Soviet Union. The 90s were a time when they were kind of like casting around. They didn't know who was going to be the next big rival, right? Because one thing we've seen historically, the U.S. empire needs a rival to define itself. And the 90s was in a weird way, the 90s was a decade of searching for that next rival to justify the national security, militaristic, capitalistic core of U.S. liberalism. So the 90s, you see them doing all sorts of crazy shit, right? Like bombing Yugoslavia, Serbia, not knowing, how to intervene in certain part of the world, or not intervening in certain parts of the world. And they produce, that produces people like Samantha Powers who say we'll never allow another genocide to happen again. And we're in the middle of another genocide. The war on terror, though, kind of resolves that contradiction to a certain extent. Not the contradiction of having an empire that can produce the actual material that it needs to be an empire, right? Like the U.S. domestic manufacturing base is completely gone, particularly after 9/11. But nonetheless, Bush, to a certain extent, obviously there's a lot of convergence or parallel between the Cold War U.S. liberalism with the neoconservatism, war on terror shit that emerges, right? To me, they share a lot of basic premises. One being the U.S. primacy is unquestioned in the world. We have to be an empire. But so I think, again, going back to the point about U.S. liberalism, it has internal questions that it has not able to resolve, right? It's support for free market capitalism. It's support for quote unquote humanitarian interventions around the world. So when Trump wins, it gives them the opportunity to not go through some sort of self-reflection or introspection to be what's going on with the basic ideology of the U.S. national security state since the end of World War II. They just displace it onto Trump, right? And Trump becomes an existential evil. They displace it onto Russia, right? We had that Russiagate shit that we were subjected to for 2-3 years. It still comes out sometimes. Right, China also starts to serve that function as well, right? Obama's final years are spent trying to do his famous pivot to Asia and confronting the rise of China. So yeah, I think this empire is in crisis because its ideological prerogatives are in crisis, and they haven't really been addressed. So in an internal way, so they're going to continue. This empire continues to lash out in search of external enemies to justify its reason of being and existence. But again, one of the ways that I think about the U.S.-Mexico border is that not only has this historically been a site where U.S. empire has been created, it's also the site where all the contradictions of U.S. empire comes home. And one way we can kind of trace it is by looking at one particular fortress called Fort Huachuca that I've written about. It's in eastern Arizona. It's about 10 miles from the U.S.-Mexico border. It was founded in the late 19th century as a fort to fight against the Apaches, right? One of the longest wars that we rarely think about, the Apache Wars. It then will serve as a fortress again during the Mexican Revolution in 1910. It will deploy soldiers to prevent cross-border filtration by Mexican revolutionaries. It will participate in the punitive expedition when the Americans sent in their troops to go after Mexican revolutionary Pancho Villa, which they failed to do. And Pancho Villa allegedly has that famous quote where he says, the Americans came in like proud eagles and they left like wet hens, which to me is such a good quote that we can use for the entirety of the history of U.S. empire. And, if during the 1950s, 1960s, once we get into the national security state and Cold War liberalism, it becomes a site of technological and electronic surveillance frontier innovation, right? They're the ones who helped design McNamara's line that was supposed to divide North Vietnam from South Vietnam. All these, advanced sensors and technologies that were supposed to prevent filtration by the North Vietnamese into South Vietnam. That stuff failed, but all that technology, as I mentioned at the beginning of our talk, gets sent back to the U.S.-Mexico border to help police another war from the perspective of U.S. officials. By the time we get to, during the 1980s, they helped train, some of the worst torturers in Cold War Latin American history. By the time we get to post 9/11, the woman who ran Abu Ghraib, she gets sent to Fort Huachuca to continue teaching people how to interrogate, which is like awful to think about. A couple years ago, it became the U.S. largest drone operating base, like training base, because they were expecting like a war with Iran, right? So it's that fort to me just lays out so like cleanly and succinctly like how the U.S. empire gets reproduced at the U.S.-Mexico border. But again, all those actions that are carried far beyond the domestic borders of this country, well, blows back. It comes back, and one way it comes back is by people trying to gain entry into the United States through the U.S.-Mexico border, whether it's Central Americans who are fleeing horrific situations in their home countries, in large part horrific situations created by U.S. support for death squad regimes and military dictatorships in the 70s, 80s, up until the early 90s. That is then followed by the promotion and pushing of neoliberal economic policies that further dispossesses and plunders the lands of these people, who, of course, are going to come to the United States. And one example that I think about a lot is, Guatemala suffered the horrific genocide of Mayan peoples in the early 1980s, in large part helped, facilitated, trained, organized by Israeli military advisors who were working with the Guatemalan military dictatorship. These Guatemalans who then decades later flee what that type of counterinsurgent genocide produced in their countries make it to the U.S.-Mexico border. They make it to Arizona. And what do they confront? They confront 50-something fixed surveillance towers that are built and run by Elbit Systems. So not only does U.S. empire serve as a site of all these contradictions, the U.S.-Mexico border, not only does it serve as a site of all U.S. imperial contradictions coming home, but the militarization of the space then represents like a last gasp effort to hold those back. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work. What it does produce is increasingly hateful, racist, quasi-genocidal political language internally within the United States when it comes to the issue of migrants and refugees and asylum seekers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to get into that a little bit. And I did see a couple questions from the chat, and I starred those, so we'll come back to those in a little bit. But you sent me a couple pieces to look at, and maybe you could say a little bit about, because I think they're not published yet, right? They're like
I think the two border ones are published. The Lucio Cabañas one is not published yet.
Okay, yeah. And yeah, so yeah, maybe we could also, I can link them or tell folks where they're at too. But one of the things you talk about in this is like understanding the US-Mexico border as like, a state of exception. And you call attention to it as a site of war without end, and look at it as a zone where obviously the state's involved, as we've talked about, Border Patrol, ICE obviously is, but all of that. And but it's also this place, and we see this, every once in a while there's some coverage of it. There was more about this during the Trump era when, the media cared about like making a spectacle about the border at different times, where you have like these fascistic, paramilitary forces also that operate, and are not, there's no accountability for them. And they, basically operate with a kind of right to kill or a right to disappear. And you talk about that in your piece too, this right to disappear, which also you talk about interestingly on the Mexico, in Mexico as well. But so there's that element, and maybe to bring it in, I think one person is quoted in your piece as describing the border area as the United States as Gaza. And we think about these connections, as you talked about. You mentioned Elbit Systems a minute ago, between like border technology in Palestine and that connection to our border wall, because there's these very real material connections between the companies that produce the technology for both. But that's interesting also, I found in that piece that you would find this, probably ex-military, I think it was an ex-military guy, saying that this is our Gaza. And so, yeah, maybe you could just talk a little bit about those aspects of it as well, which obviously is stoked by the way that the media and the politicians also talk about the border and the people who are attempting to cross it.
Yeah. These, in many ways, the border was created by extra official or paramilitary forces to begin with, right? Like these in the 19th century, you have essentially white death squads who were killing indigenous peoples as they moved the frontier west, right? I'm thinking especially, I mean, even though they became official, the Texas Rangers, right? If you read Blood Meridian, man, like they've been part and parcel of the creation and reproduction of what we now know as the U.S.-Mexico border, from the Texas Rangers and to the Minutemen vigilante. I think that's the guy where I got the quote from, right? Who in 2005, 2006, which is a really interesting moment, right? Like it's around the moment where Israel takes its settlers and its soldiers out of Gaza. And this guy, who's part of a paramilitary white supremacist vigilante group in Arizona, is obviously probably shaped by this context. And he says, well, in a way that it's almost like a premonition, right? Like in a way he's saying, everything south of this border is going to be our Gaza, right? This idea that he thinks that the United States coexists with an entity that he codes as Gaza. And the way he codes it is most likely like it's 9/11 shit, right? So it's like it's Islamo-fascist terrorism, or whatever that horrible term was. And at the time, there was also a lot of effort by the U.S. State Department and certain, especially Florida politicians. They really went out of their ways to try to create links between Hezbollah, Venezuela, and Mexican drug cartels. Like they again trying to create that specter of fear that tends to discipline politically. But yeah, reading that guy's quotes now is kind of crazy, right? Like I think I read that quote now in a slightly different way. But going back to your original point, yeah, these paramilitary groups have been part and parcel of the creation and reproduction of the U.S.-Mexico border from its beginning, from before there was even something called the U.S.-Mexico border, right? The Texas Rangers, or the predecessor of the Texas Rangers, helped Texas, quote unquote, liberate itself from Mexico in the 1830s. When you have the U.S.-Mexico War in the mid-19th century, the people who are committing the worst human rights atrocities, right? Killing, plundering, raping civilians, were groups like the Texas Rangers and these like different Southern state volunteer groups, where you, on the one hand, on the other hand, you have U.S. Army people watching them do their shit. And they're like, people like Ulysses Grant in their letters are saying like, oh my God, we can't believe that they're doing this. So, and we've seen this throughout. We saw the Klan had their own border watch under David Duke in the late 70s, early 80s. And there's a bunch of military, rabidly anti-communist, racist military veterans in the 1980s who formed their own groups to try to, quote unquote, police the border. And, the Border Patrol kind of gives them a wink and a nod, right? Like they know they're working together. And this is also another staple, right? Since the Border Patrol was founded in 1924, they have a particular type of relationship with these paramilitary forces as they, quote unquote, try to police the border. It's interesting that under Trump, we didn't see as much of this. I think we did see it here in Arizona. We saw some pretty crazy, quote unquote, patriot groups, but I don't remember them being as big of a thing as immediately after 9/11, where you had this idea that, and you still hear it today, right? That there was Al-Qaeda was setting up camps on the Mexican side of the Texas border, and they were going to send in, quote unquote, anchor babies with this it's like this prolonged popular warfare strategy of like creating birthing militants and then sending them into the U.S. And 20 years later, they're going to be like Al-Qaeda people to try to overthrow the U.S. It was insane, right? Like Louis Gohmert, the representative from Texas, was like infamous for saying these crazy shit. Right. So the convergence of like paramilitary and military official state agents at the border has been a long one, and they work they work together. They always have worked together, and they continue to work together, even if now we don't, they don't have as much visibility. And in many ways, they're indistinguishable, right? Because they're doing the same thing. La pinche migra, as people in my community refer to the Border Patrol. They may be, predominantly Latino or Mexican American now, but they're still doing the same shit that their white predecessors were doing decades ago. They're still going around slashing, canisters of water that are left behind by humanitarian groups to help migrants who are dying of thirst. And we have some pretty, we have a lot of evidence. No more deaths. No más muertes, no more deaths. A great organization here in Arizona that does a lot of humanitarian work at the border, but also does a really good. They have some really good research and reports that they've put out in the past decade or so about Border Patrol violence towards migrants. This is all to say that the border is a state of exception. It has been from its inception. It continues to be a state of exception. It's coded into U.S. law, right? That 100-mile zone around the United States from their borders is a zone where laws and rights can be unilaterally suspended by Border Patrol agents and the dozen or so other police agencies that exist on the U.S.-Mexico border. I grew up in Central California on the coast in a town called San Luis Obispo. And I remember as a kid, my parents taught us, look, those vans or those trucks that are white and light green, those are the migra trucks. We gotta be on the lookout for them. And as I got older, I thought, what the hell? We're like hundreds of miles north of the California-Mexico border. What were they doing here? Well, they count the Pacific Ocean as a border. So, they can extend from the coastline 100 miles into California, Oregon, and Washington. And that's part of this zone of a state of exception that exists throughout the country. And the vast majority of U.S. citizens live in that zone. It's the coast. So when we saw the protests in Portland, when was that? Was it around 2020, 2019, 2020? You had Border Patrol Special Forces units in Portland, picking people up and throwing them into unmarked vans and then interrogating them, and then a day later releasing them, right? That's Border Patrol Special Forces that had received training in Iraq and Afghanistan, who are supposed to be working at the quote unquote border, being deployed against U.S. citizens using their right of peaceful assembly and free speech and all those bourgeois rights that can be suspended at a moment's notice.
I think it was during the 2020,
2020, right? Yeah.
Because it was part of the George Floyd stuff and everything that, then, people were like, why are there DHS trucks scooping up the protesters? Right. Yeah.
And that was their justification. And they could be ordered directly by DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, which in and of itself is a post 9/11 invention. Just like ICE, that other internal migration police, border police, is also a post 9/11 invention. And that zone of exception, that state of exception, has been used to discipline different populations that have lived, for more than 100 years on the U.S.-Mexico border, right? The Tohono O'odham peoples in Arizona, whose reservation crosses both sides of the border. Mexican-American populations who live in this border area, but because they're Mexican-American, because of the color of their skin, they'll be treated as if they were undocumented migrants by border police. And they're subject to the same surveillance and surveillance technology that it currently exists on the border, presumably to keep out people from coming into the country, right? So it's a state of exception where it's very easy to suspend any sort of rights. And in the past, it's caused horrific damage to trans-border communities, to Mexican-American or Latino communities on the border, to Native American communities. It's been used sometimes to justify deportations, right? Now that we hear Trump saying, a centerpiece of his campaign is mass deportations now, he makes references to this operation in the early 1950s called Operation Wetback, where different police agencies from different levels did manage to deport something like 1.5 million people from the United States. We now know that a large percentage of those were Mexican Americans. When they did something similar during the Great Depression in the early 1930s, same thing. More than 1 million people were coerced into leaving the United States or were forcibly taken out of the United States. We know that a big percentage of those people were also U.S. citizens, but because they were Mexican American, they were also kicked out. Right. So it's for me, one of the things that I see happening, and going back to the comment about children of men Democrats, is that this state of exception is going beyond the 100-mile limit. And we see that, I think I read that growth, that undemocratic growth of that state of exception, the way that politicians have been talking about the border and migration policies. Especially in a situation where we're only going to get more mass human movement as a consequence of climate change. Are we going to build more walls? Are we going to fund more border police? Or are we going to do something more radical? Are we going to do something different than what we've been witnessing the last 4 decades at least? Are we going to continue to, as a country, to support a necropolitical politics of mass migrant death? Or are we going to do something that actually addresses the reasons of why they're moving, and we accept them in the United States? Unfortunately, the barbarism part seems to be winning, and not the more radical liberatory part. But I think, you and I were talking before this, and I've written about this. I think this is why Gaza is really important. One reason why Gaza is really important. I mean, last year at the UN climate change conference, the president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, made this point. He did and I've shared this on Twitter. He made a point where he connected the genocide in Gaza to climate change to migration, and he makes the point where he says, "Listen, like, what's happening in Gaza is a dress rehearsal for how the global north is going to manage the mass movements of peoples from the global south to the global north as a consequence of climate change fueled by capitalism." And he has this one quote that's like really stands out to me, where he said, "The immense exodus will have a response in the north. We are already seeing it in the anti-immigration policies of rich countries and the rise of the extreme right within them. Hitler is knocking on the European and American middle class homes' doors, and many are letting them in. The exodus will be responded to with a lot of violence and barbarism. What we are seeing in Gaza is a rehearsal of the future. Why have large carbon-consuming countries allowed the systematic murder of thousands of children in Gaza? Because Hitler has already entered their homes, and they are getting ready to defend their high levels of carbon consumption and reject the exodus that it causes. We can then see the future, the breakdown of democracy and the barbarism unleashed against our people, against the people who do not emit CO2, the poor people. Is this future of a generalized Gaza against the growing exodus of our people avoidable?" And I think that last question really like neatly sums up the struggle for today.
Absolutely. That's great. I'm going to put the link to that into the chat. Hopefully that'll go through. But yeah, it's on People's Dispatch. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that and sending that along. So I'm going to pull a couple of questions in from the chat. Guerrero, thank you for the support. Asked, what do you think about nearshoring, and how would that affect the relationship between U.S. and Mexican relationship towards immigration?
So that's a great question. I was going to mention nearshoring when you brought up the point about China, Jay. One way that the Biden administration especially has tried to resolve that issue of an inexistent or really limited domestic manufacturing base is to encourage companies who were producing in China to come back closer to the United States, and that's what nearshoring refers to, right? You want to have a manufacturing industrial base that's located not in your geopolitical rival and enemy, but ostensibly in the country of your ally or someone that you consider to be an ally. And Mexico, right, is best geographically placed to benefit from this so-called nearshoring. The problem is that is the tricky relationship between the governing Morena party in Mexico and the United States. Particularly when under Morena, there has been an improvement in the wages and working conditions and everyday lives of Mexican workers, right? So how will that match up with the logic of nearshoring, which is still based on the fact that Mexican workers will produce just as much as American workers, probably even more, but are willing to accept much lower wages? And there's also just a geopolitical relationship between someone like Andrés Manuel López Obrador in the United States, Both sides are really willing to work together when it comes to stopping migration, right? Like the reason why for most of this year, we've seen a precipitous drop in what the Border Patrol refers to as quote unquote encounters at the border is because Mexico is the Border Patrol. AMLO is working as a sort of colonial border police for the United States, and they're just not letting migrants reach the U.S.-Mexico border. They're keeping them in southern Mexico. They're keeping them in other parts of the country. So there's also the contradiction of AMLO talking about economic sovereignty, of trying to craft over the course of his 6 years in presidential office, of trying to craft a more independent economic policy that he refers to as anti-neoliberalism, or he crows about the death of neoliberalism. So that type of language will tend to scare off companies that are willing to engage in this nearshoring. But that's like from the Biden administration's perspective, that's their way to resolve that issue, to stop transnational companies, particularly American transnational companies, from continuing to produce in China and bringing them back to the Americas, and then almost using it as a buy off, right? Like nearshoring becomes some way to like buy off of governments, friendly or not, in the Americas, and getting them into the United States. The broader story here too is that in the last 10 years at least, maybe even toward the last years of the pink tide, China has become the main trading partner for almost all of Latin America. I think Mexico might be the only exception where the US continues to be its main trading partner, but the rest of the region depends on China. And when they try to break away, modify that relationship, like the current insane president of Argentina, Milei, they suffer horrific economic consequences. And I think the inflation and rate in Argentina right now, it's the highest in the world. It's in like 300% or something crazy like that. So, but the nearshoring one is interesting, and we'll see what happens with the incoming president of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, because she's talked about nearshoring, but she talks about it almost like in a way of like capitalism with a human face, like capitalist investment with a human face. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out.
Yeah, that will be for sure. Back to the comment you made on China. I mean, why does it produce such strong inflation? Is it because they can't find a trading partner that can really replace like what China does? Is there some like, does China have like what? Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Argentina was sending, it was agricultural products, and maybe like livestock, like beef, and then so trying to like completely reorient your political economy for ideological reasons, because Milei is an insane, supposedly libertarian, right? But libertarians always have the fangs, right? They're libertarians economically, far right, they're a military dictatorship, right? So a police state. And Argentina has long-standing political economic issues that also have not been completely resolved even during the previous decade. Well, let's just say that they had issues with borrowing, who they were borrowing from, and who they decided not to pay. And then once they finally paid it off, then you have a right winger who comes into power in the 2010s toward the end of the pink tide, and he starts to borrow again. And this has been in the last 20, 30 years, it's kind of been like a cyclical recurrence in Argentina. But one way that Argentina did, it did become, China does become its main, I think it's its main trading partner. I'm pretty sure it was, at least. And then to shift that, to sever that relationship or limit it. And he hasn't done it completely, right? Because he's not all the way stupid, but it has had like a economic impact on that country.
Not all the way stupid. I
mean, he talks to his dead dogs, so like, he's a strange dude.
Yeah, he's very strange. I mean, he's like looks like he's like out. I forget, somebody gave a really good description of him, but he looks like an SNL cast character or something like that. Like he's not a serious looking human being.
You know what? I think he's trying to look like, if you've seen like paintings of these dudes, I think what he's trying to go for, that look, is like the 19th century, like Latin American independence heroes. I think that's what his hair and his sideburns, and I think that's what he's like trying to look like, but who knows?
Got it. So Guerrero also asks, when you speak of immigration. Can you expand on American immigration in Mexico, the so-called gentrification in states of Mexico?
Oh
I mean, this is
man.
an interesting thing that's been
Yeah,
going
yeah,
on
yeah.
for the last several years, where you have a lot of people who, and this is like, is interesting. I mean, I read a book like this earlier in my life that was, it was called The 4 Hour Work Week, and it was like some Princeton guy who figured out, like, if he lived in, like, if he made his money, like, through I don't want to get into it. It's stupid, but the point was, like, he was like encouraging people to immigrate, like, not full time, but like to live a lot of their life in the global south, where they could get cheaper housing and food and everything else, and earn their income from like global north work, basically.
Yeah.
And so therefore, like, and so this has been a way that people who, for instance, as like social security, as like people's as the social wage declines, like, how do people also make it go further? They move to the global south. But anyways, yeah, talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, there's a long history of American expatriates living in Mexico, right? There's the famous, San Miguel de Allende in Guanajuato, which is basically, it's a, picturesque town. A lot of American expats live there. Different religious communities have moved to Mexico in the 20th century, the Mennonites, Mormons. This current one, though, has to do with the pandemic, right? These so-called digital nomads who, when the country, quote unquote, shut down, although in places like Arizona, I feel like that shutdown didn't really last very long. But so when the economy supposedly shut down, and these people worked some sort of job where they could, like, work remotely, they moved down in large numbers, moved down to Mexico City. And Mexico City never had the type of like restrictive anti-pandemic rules that were in place in places like California. So they took advantage of that. They took advantage of, moving into like beautiful, great neighborhood, wealthy neighborhoods in Mexico City. But they had dollars, right? So they could buy up Mexican property, or and live down there, and have access to cheaper housing, cheaper food. If you have dollars, you have access to cheaper healthcare, good healthcare, affordable healthcare. And but they continue to work, and they continue to get paid in cash, in dollars, and that's the big difference. It happened to the scale, though, that they gentrified certain neighborhoods in Mexico City, and they increased the property values, especially in like these neighborhoods in the central west of Mexico City, like Condesa, Roma, where you started to see 2020, 2021, you started to see graffiti like "Yankees Go Home," which is really, like, I laugh because it's like really wealthy Mexicans who were probably like spray painting that, which is like, it's kind of a funny dynamic. But yeah, so these so-called digital nomads who moved down there, whether permanently or momentarily, they raise the cost of living for Mexicans, especially in Mexico City. I think that's where I'm most familiar with. I don't know how it probably happened in other regional cities that they picked for a variety of reasons, like Oaxaca City probably experienced something similar, although there might be tourism. I know like Tulum and like those type of resort cities like probably experienced something similar. But in Mexico City, you're seeing housing has become extremely unaffordable, and not just like in the immediate neighborhoods that these digital nomads move to, but it's like expanded throughout the city. So it's become an important issue.
Yeah, appreciate that. Yeah, I don't know about this. How likely is it that the U.S. may invade northern Mexico, in a sense, occupy them to control the refugee crisis? I guess another part I could add on to that question is like something you kind of talked about earlier, with like the collaboration that exists between states around like migration. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think Harsha Walia does a good job of talking about this in terms of like border imperialism in the book Border and Rule. And thinking about how, one of the ways that countries like the United States, but also Europe, also Australia, seek to stem like migration is by basically, exporting that process further and further out so that they get other countries to collaborate with them on these processes, to stem the tide of people coming to their country by basically exporting the borders or strengthening the borders of other countries in certain ways.
Yeah, her work, Walia's work, is really good. I would also shout out a journalist based in Tucson, Todd Miller, who has a book called Empire of Borders. It's really good as well, showing how the U.S. outsources its border policing to countries throughout the world too, like not just in the Americas or the Caribbean, but in places like Africa, where they're trying to really stem the ability of people to even think about migrating practically at the point of origin, right? So you have U.S. forces in Africa that are designed just to do that. This question, I think, has a lot to do with the discussions that emerged during the Republican primary, where these candidates were seemingly trying to one up one another and talking about invading Mexico as a way to stop the fentanyl crisis. Vivek, like what was his last, Ramaswamy, all these people, right? DeSantis, they were talking about like shooting people dead at the border. They were going to invade Mexico. They all agreed that they were going to somehow violate the national and territorial sovereignty of Mexico. They just had like different approaches to it. So somebody would talk about full-scale invasion. Other people, Trump, I guess when he was in office, according to some of these people in his cabinet, was saying he wanted like JSOC, like drone hits on like, narco traffickers as a way to stem the flow. But that's to hear, we had like a year of this. This is like a late 2023 discussion, like months and months of Republicans saying, we're going to invade Mexico. We just differ on methods and scale of it. And I don't know how to, what odds to give. I mean, it would be, obviously, if something like this happened, would be horrific, right? If it's on the level of like drone strikes, which is again, like very 9/11 type approach to dealing with an issue as myriad and complicated as like narco trafficking and production, like that would be horrific in and of its own right. But to think about like U.S. military personnel actually invading Mexico, which obviously they've done before, right? They did it in 1916. They did it in 1914. They did it in 1846, 1848, took like a third to a half of Mexico's national territory. So it's happened before, hasn't happened for a long time. So on the one hand, it's like, it's almost impossible for me to imagine, because one, their economies are so intertwined. Their economies fundamentally depend on one another. There's, I don't know, like 35 million people of Mexican descent living in the United States. But on the other hand, like I said, we're living in like a time of monsters, like anything's possible. We're witnessing a genocide in real time, and horrific shit has been like, I will never be the same after the 10 months of things that I've seen online. Right. Like, so anything is possible. If that would be if let's say Trump wins and he did do some sort of military action in Mexico, it would be incredibly destabilizing. The blowback on him would be, it's unimaginable. Like I can't even like think about how it would, the negative impact on the United States in a variety of different ways. Because even though Mexico is obviously much weaker politically, economically, militarily than the United States, they have this 2,000 mile long thing of leverage. They could use that to their advantage in some way. They could stop being border police for the United States and see how the United States would respond to that. I mean, I think for me, that's one of the most disappointing things I've seen with the AMLO presidency is the fact that he came to office promising to directly confront Trump and to engage in a different type of approach to Central American and Caribbean and South American migration. He talked about, building on Mexico's legacy of accepting refugees and asylum seekers from other countries. Like during the 1930s, Mexico accepted like 30 to 40,000 Spanish Republican exiles who were fleeing Francisco Franco. Mexico accepted thousands of South American exiles during the 60s and 70s during that time of like military dictatorships and state terror. But he didn't do that. He actually worked pretty closely with Trump, and he continued to work pretty closely with Biden to be their junior partner in being their colonial border police. Nonetheless, that's still that Mexico's geopolitical, like geographic location gives it leverage because it is on the southern flank of the United States. And if you think about cultural products like Red Dawn, the original movie, like there's always that anxiety by US empire designers and thinkers that like this is the weak point of the US empire. It's not the Canadian border, it's the southern flank. And that's why movies that talk about the fall of the US or discuss any sort of like apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic vision, like the southern flank is the one that represents some sort of important point, not the northern one.
Right on, cool. There's a couple other quick questions, and then one that might take a little bit longer, and then we could talk a little bit. We can kind of tease the next conversation we're going to have with
Okay.
David Chavez and sort of start to wind down. And thank you so much for this discussion today. So simple one, somebody asked if you know where you got your shirt from.
This was a fundraiser last year that the Green Brigade did, the ultra Celtic group, professional team in Scotland. Their ultras, their fans are notoriously, famously pro-Palestine. So the Green Brigade, which is I think their more radical group, they did a fundraiser, and it's on the back. It says "You'll never walk alone" in the flag of Palestine colors, and this is what this means. So yeah, that was like a fundraiser from like late last year.
Right on. Arya asks, this was about when you were talking about David Duke, I think, earlier on, and like the KKK and their border. So they were just curious about the connection, what you thought that came out of.
Yeah, I mean, that was their effort to kind of regain some sort of public notoriety, I guess, in the late 70s, early 80s, right? We have obviously they did some horrific shit. What was in the late 1970s when they killed the Revolutionary Worker Party militants? Was it North Carolina? I can't remember, but it was part of a broader effort to become more publicly visible. And someone like David Duke thought that the issue of undocumented migration could help the group recapture like its political prominence. And if you look at like just mainstream newspaper coverage of undocumented migration in the 70s and 80s, it's like pretty insane. Like the language they're using, the fact that we don't use the word alien anymore is almost it is a victory, like a discursive victory, because it's just illegal alien. And it's good that it's not, I mean, obviously the Republicans will still use it, but it's not as mainstream as it was in the 80s and in the 70s and 80s when you have, I mean, I remember one op-ed that I found in the LA Times talks about how aliens are creating a beachhead for the third world by coming into this country, like crazy shit like that. So I think that's what the KKK was trying to do, but it's the KKK, right? So they got kind of run out and they didn't really do much. The more prominent groups were these like Vietnam veterans who created these really radical groups. I can't remember the name of it. They're like based in Alabama. Kathleen Ballou has a really good book on this, the resurgence of border paramilitaries in the 80s and their connections to Vietnam and their efforts to do things like launch coups d'etats in like the island nation of Dominica. Like these guys were, but they were kind of like the unofficial face of like Reagan policy towards Central America, right? Like they were involved, what Reagan was doing in Central America officially and unofficially, these guys were kind of like the paramilitary version of it. They shared the same goals to a certain extent. I think that the second KKK of the 20s was much more influential, right? Like I think when you had the KKK marching in the thousands in Washington, D.C., we know that a lot of the first, second generations of Border Patrol agents that again was founded in 1924 were like KKK or KKK adjacent people who thought like the KKK had a lot to do with the 1924 National Origins Act that restricted immigration pretty much only to like Northern Europeans. They made an exception for Latin Americans, specifically Mexicans, because they needed workers. But a lot of that was influenced by like eugenics thinking, imperialist, colonialist thinking of the era, KKK shit. The KKK of the 20s was very anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic. Like they were really against, the more like Southern European and Jewish immigration that came in the U.S. 1880s up until the 1920s. Very anti-Italian. They didn't like the Corleones. So That KKK was very, I think, influential in some, at least intellectually, with the ideas that came into creating the National Origins Act and 4 or 5 decades of white supremacist immigration policy in the U.S.
Yeah, and it also coincided with like Wilson and Harding were both like, I forget which one of them was that screened Birth of a Nation. I think it was Wilson.
That was
at
Wilson. Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
he was a Confederate, like unredeemed Southern Confederate. Yeah, and he's like the guy who, ordered the invasion of Mexico, right? And his language towards Mexico during his administration is really interesting. There's one political cartoon that I put on Twitter sometimes where it's like it says "white man's burden," and it's Woodrow Wilson carrying the map of Mexico on his back. It's like, that's like a very consistent U.S. approach to Mexico ever since then, I think.
Right on. All right, last question from the audience, and then we'll say a little bit about our next conversation. So Guerrero asks, when you speak of AMLO as being the frontier police, what do you think about the secret meetings between Maru Campos and Abbott towards immigration?
I mean, I think don't remember who Maru Campos is. I think I have an idea, but I'm not completely sure. I think this is just part of the broader political decision made at the leadership of Morena and in the AMLO administration to engage in this type of border policing. I mean, I think AMLO has consistently pointed toward like opinion polls in Mexico that said that he says makes the argument back up his policy towards Central American and Caribbean, especially Haitian refugees. So he'll say, look, I'm just, what my policies reflect popular opinion. But I think there's there's pretty quid pro quo going on, right? Like, I think he thinks that like, if he acts as border police for the United States, that gives him room to maneuver in other issues, political, economic issues, energy sovereignty issues, trying to assume some sort of like regional leadership role within the Americas where he can kind of, he can be seen as like rejecting certain U.S. policies in the region and emerges as a leader, which he kind of has done, right? I think there's a political give and take right there. And he doesn't, right. Yeah. That's why I didn't know who Maru Campos is, because the PAN Guerrero is like the farthest thing from my mind. But yeah, they're important political faction, especially in northern Mexico. So I think it's like this political give and take. And he says, look, and there's a calculus there somewhere where it's like, he's not going to suffer domestically, politically by doing this, where he could in other issues. So he decides to do it, and it gives him a negotiating tool with whatever U.S. president is in office, right? Because I think he's smart enough to know, he is smart enough to know that when it comes to migration, there's not a lot of difference. To go back to where we began, there's not a lot of difference between the political parties.
Yeah. I think that's certainly true, especially, perhaps always, but certainly right now. So let's talk a little bit though. So there's another friend of the show, David Chavez, is going to join us next time. The three of us are going to talk a little bit about your work. Is Luis Cabañas? Is that right?
Lucio Cabañas.
Lucio. Right. So say a little bit about that. I mean, one of the things that's interesting, and that also weaves into one of the pieces that I read. I think it kind of connects in certain ways to both the pieces that you sent me. But part of what you're looking at there also is like domestic counterinsurgency and kind of disappearances and things like this within Mexican history too. And so that'll be really interesting to delve into. But yeah, if you want to say a little bit about that, just to kind of tease it for folks.
Yeah, so I think we'll discuss a book that I published in 2014 called Specters of Revolution, Peasant Guerrillas in the Cold War Mexican Countryside. And this book kind of chronicles a history of two separate peasant guerrilla movements that emerged in the state of Guerrero in the 60s and 70s. Guerrero is that state in southern Mexico made famous by, I don't know, like Acapulco. I guess that's why people would know it. These guerrilla movements were both led by school teachers The more prominent of the groups, politically and militarily, was called the Party of the Poor. It was led by a rural communist school teacher, Lucio Cabañas, who was a member of the Mexican Communist Party. And then once he adopted armed self-defense that then led to armed guerrilla struggle, he broke with the party, and he led this movement from the late 60s to 1974. And they were able to, at least in coastal Guerrero, establish a pretty sizable political influence. They managed to ambush the Mexican military and cause them a considerable number of casualties, which is one reason why you won't see any Mexican politician try to co-opt the figure of Lucio Cabañas, because the Mexican military will not allow it. And honestly, the Mexican military still refers to him as a bandit, as a criminal. This year is the 50th anniversary of his death. He died fighting the Mexican military on December 2nd, 1974. So he went to as a student to become a rural school teacher. He went to a place called Ayotzinapa. Ayotzinapa has been infamous, been made known since 2014, when 43 students from that school were kidnapped and disappeared by a constellation of criminal and state groups, and we still don't know what happened to them, right? So this happened in September of 2014. So my book came out like right before that, and it was this weird convergence, right? Because a lot of these students felt like they were carrying the legacy of Lucio Cabañas in their political activism and in their training to become rural school teachers. In the book, I talk about the guerrillas. I also talk about what the Mexican government under the PRI, this political party that ruled Mexico for 8 decades, what they did to annihilate this group. And it was to wage what in Mexico they referred to as quote unquote dirty war, right? State terrorism under a pretty brutal counterinsurgency that, at least in Guerrero, disappeared we know for sure it disappeared between 600 and 800 people, probably more. And they did horrific things like torture, rape, the raising of peasant villages, the use of death flight. So we can, I'm sure with David, we'll talk a lot about that when we meet up next week. My current research actually kind of also is on Guerrero, but it uses the dirty war to make the argument that this is the origin point of like the so-called war on drugs in Mexico, because the same military people who wiped out this communist peasant guerrilla group would also become very prominent within the broader political economy of narcotics in Mexico, right? So there's some really intimate connections between the Mexican dirty war and the emergence of the war on drugs.
I look forward to it. That'll be fascinating. December 2nd, the day of his assassination, is also my birthday, so that's an interesting.
I think John Brown too, right?
Yeah.
I think John Brown too.
I think that's also. I think it's the day of his death too, right? Like I think in both cases, but
this day. Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah, John Brown's day of his death. Yeah.
So, anyways, so yeah. Appreciate it, Alex. It's been great to be in conversation with you again. I look forward to doing, following up next week with more. Thanks everybody in the chat for your participation, your questions. They were great. And yeah, so I look forward to more work with you.
Thanks, man. Thanks, Jay. See you next week.